Hey climbers, welcome back to Climb by VSC, a weekly show about building and scaling startups in the world of climate innovation. My name is Vijay Kapoor, general partner of VSC Ventures and co-host of Climb. Every week, I or a member of our VSC team will speak with a pioneer in the climate tech world about emerging technologies and novel ideas that will turn the tide on climate change. We've all heard enough of the doom and gloom. It's time for stories of purpose-driven innovation that lead to sustainable, positive change. As always, I'm so happy that you've decided to join us. Now let's climb.
Tim Chant is a senior climate reporter at TechCrunch and founder and editor at Futureproof, a publication covering climate and energy. Futureproof helps you make eco-friendly decisions when it comes to the stuff you buy, with the goal of helping you to reduce your carbon footprint, one purchase at a time. Tim is also a lecturer at MIT's graduate program in science and has written for Wired, the Chicago Tribune, and Nova Next, among others. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rick. Good to be here.
Yeah, we've had an opportunity to work together in your role at TechCrunch, but I'd love for our audience to learn a little bit about you. You have an interesting life that crosses journalism, academia, and community building. Can you share more about your journey and the common threads across your work?
Yeah, it was, to be honest, not a very direct path, which I think a lot of people would understand. I started out wanting to be a professor. I loved environmental science, thinking about ecology and big systems and stuff like that, and figured I would do that and be able to kind of write on the side. But a few years into grad school, I realized that my true passion was in journalism and started to think more seriously about that. So then when I finished my degree, I decided to switch kind of whole hog into journalism and went from there. So I had a number of other jobs, of course, before I landed at TechCrunch, but I've been thinking about climate and energy and the environment in particular for, almost 20 years now.
Where did you go to school for? Did you study journalism ultimately at school?
I actually did not. So I went to St. Olaf College for undergraduate and studied environmental science and English. So I wanted to kind of do both as long as I could and managed to at least carry it through my undergraduate career. And then I made that switch to focusing on academia and environmental science in grad school. So I went to UC Berkeley and did my PhD there, studying the oak woodlands in the California Bay Area, trying to look at how urbanism in particular was affecting the patterns that we saw on the landscape as a result of deforestation, and then the gradual grow back as people planted maybe oak trees in their yards and things like that. And then I also looked a little bit at how the physiology of the trees changed over time. But as I did that, I took a class at the journalism school at UC Berkeley and realized that really that was where kind of things were heading for me. I really enjoyed the science, but I really loved being able to explore other topics and talk to other people and see what they were doing, and then share those stories with the general public. So I did that. I also wrote for the Berkeley Science Review, which is like a grad student run magazine on campus. And then did a AAAS Mass Media Fellowship at the Chicago Tribune. And that was really kind of my trial by fire in journalism. So I spent 2.5 months in the newsroom and did it all. It was a great summer.
Yeah. All right, let's dive a little bit deeper into the journalism aspects there. So climate-related journalism can cover a wide swath at this point. What excites you the most about climate coverage?
Yeah, I think at this point, climate coverage is a great place to be, and is exciting for me because it feels like we're finally making progress. For a long time, it was really kind of taking people through the basics of climate change, thinking about how do we explain the latest IPCC report, really the basics when it came down to it, like what's been happening over the last several decades, what's the future going to look like. And to be honest, it was a little bit depressing at times thinking about that kind of stuff. That's not to say that the outlook's any better these days, but what I will say is that for the most part, people seem to accept and understand the very basic science of climate change, and so we're able to move on and start talking about solutions and ways that we're going to address the issue.
So Tim, let's dive more broadly into your coverage. What makes a story particularly compelling for you? What do you look for before diving in or researching a piece?
Yeah, one of the things I do is I look for a fresh take on the topic, right? That might seem like a pretty stock and standard answer. But I mean, that's really true. If it's a story that hasn't been told before, if it's a technology I haven't seen, if it's an angle that appears new, that's always something I'm looking for. Another thing I like to do is there a story, that could be kind of like a news piece or something that lets me tell a larger story? So one example of this was in the fall, I'd been thinking a lot about fusion for a while, and I'd been thinking about a fresh way to cover it. There'd been a lot that had already been said about fusion over the years, much of which was focused on the delays that had kind of racked up at ITER, the International Experimental Reactor, and how fusion always seemed to be 20, 30 years into the future and kind of like, would it ever actually happen? But in the last 5 years, I'd seen a lot more activity in the fusion space. There were a lot more startups. Obviously, scientists that have been working on it were more confident in bringing their work out of the lab and putting it in front of investors. And investors at the same time also seemed to be more receptive. And so it seemed like there was something happening there. And so as I was thinking about it, it kind of reminded me of the theory of punctuated equilibrium, which is kind of one explanation for why the species we see on Earth are what they are. And basically what it boils down to is you get these periods of like explosive growth in the number of species that happen. And it could be because, events kind of like come together to not necessarily conspire, but like create the conditions that cause this, maybe an asteroid or a sea level rise or a mountain range rising, something like that. And as I started digging into it in fusion, it turned out that there was research done as how it applies to kind of the business and technology worlds by Daniel Leventhal at the Wharton School. And what he said is that, yes, this theory does apply, and that you can end up looking at something like fusion and saying, yeah, we're seeing a lot of these same sort of conditions that you might expect in a punctuated environment, equilibrium environment. And in the case of fusion, what we're looking at is there is a rapid advancement in semiconductors. So obviously chips have gotten exponentially faster thanks to the adherence, or at least the kind of the following of Moore's law that the semiconductor manufacturers have been able to follow. And then along with that, that's enabled kind of the resurgence in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Fusion in particular is well suited to machine learning. Fusion is basically like trying to contain these really unstable, hot plasmas. And in order to do that, there's numerous knobs, essentially, that scientists and engineers can turn. And, turning them one at a time to kind of create an experimental condition is really challenging. Humans would be very slow at it, whereas this is something that computers and machine learning excels at. So that allowed them to make pretty rapid progress in recent years. And then the third thing that helped is this rapid development in high temperature superconductors. Now, high temperature here is all relative. We're still talking about things that are, kind of cryogenically frozen to keep them cold enough to maintain those superconducting conditions. But what that meant was that suddenly you had magnets that didn't require as much energy to cool, and thus the power plant didn't require as much energy to run, which makes fusion power much more realistic if you have much lower overhead. And so all of those things didn't necessarily happen at the same time independent of each other. There were certainly reinforcements happening between them. But because of that, then you started to see fusion take greater and greater strides, and investors started matching that with more investment dollars. And then as we saw from the National Ignition Facility in December, we finally got to the point where we were able to kind of achieve ignition, as they call it, which was net positive fusion power. So a big hurdle kind of was crossed, and suddenly fusion seems a lot more realistic.
All right, Tim, I'm going to ask you to break out your crystal ball here. I'm not going to hold you to it, but this idea of punctuated equilibrium, what do you think might be the next kind of technology or the next thing that has that special spark, and that maybe this time next year everyone is talking about?
Yeah, I think we're going to start to see continued advancement in batteries in particular, I think you're starting to see a lot more unique approaches on how we design, manufacture, and then ultimately implement batteries. So for example, there was a company, Chemix, that recently raised a round, and they use artificial intelligence to design batteries. A lot of major companies are doing this. There's kind of the latest example where they're literally just focusing in on using AI in the design process, and then they're going to hand off the designs to somebody else to manufacture. I think as more companies start doing that kind of thing, you're going to start to see some of the similar advances in battery technology as we've seen in semiconductors. Now, it's not going to be quite as exponential as we've seen in semiconductors because we're not talking about a shrinking of a process. We're talking about tweaks in chemistry. So the advances here, when we're talking a big advance, are on the order of like 20, 30% as opposed to a doubling. But those compound over time. And so if we can get really significant advances in battery design and manufacturing in a few years, I think we're going to start to see batteries and electric motors kind of combine to change sectors of the economy that I don't think we've even imagined today. One thing I like to think about, it's kind of ridiculous, but the little hoverboard things that were all the rage several years ago, right? Like that wouldn't have been even imaginable 20 years ago because we just simply didn't have the battery or electronics or the motor technology to make it happen.
You've got us excited about looking forward. Let's look back for a second. What's a recent story or development you covered that really surprised you or has stayed with you since you wrote about it?
Yeah, one of them that's actually fairly recent is an Irish nonprofit actually called Energy Cloud, which came out of a startup founder, basically. He has a company currently that makes kind of smart devices that hook up to either your hot water heater or thermostat, so similar to Nest, where it's controlling some of the energy that's flowing through your house. And so he was really well versed in this world and kind of connecting to the electrical grid and thinking about, how does energy come in and leave the home? How do you manage it? And also thinking about the promise of the smart grid that's always kind of been on the horizon. And essentially what he did is he took inspiration from another Irish nonprofit called Food Cloud. And what they do is they take waste food and they give it to people in need. And he was saying, well, we can do the same thing with energy. And so he rather than just try to start this from scratch and kind of work on the problem himself, he brought a bunch of people and stakeholders into the same room. The people who run the wind farms in Ireland. Ireland's a very windy place, obviously, and so they have anywhere from like 12 to 14% wasted wind every year. And he was like, well, what if we could put that to use? And then he went and found a housing nonprofit and said, well, would your tenants essentially be, happy to use this? And they were like, well, yes, of course. And then they went to the grid provider and said, is there a way that we can make this work? We want you on our team. And I thought it was an interesting case of rather than building a solution whole hog and releasing it to the market, he went and kind of got all of the different parties in the room and tried to sort things out within the framework that already existed. And in the process, he's kind of in a way proving this group, not just him, this group is proving how a smart grid might work within the framework of existing regulations so that you don't necessarily have to kind of completely rebuild the whole regulatory process around the electrical grid, which is very dense and arcane, that maybe there's a way that you can make it work, within those bounds. And I thought it was an interesting case of the nonprofit world potentially informing the startup world. Usually we kind of think about it the other way around, but I thought this was a nice sort of cyclical process. And I don't know if you want to get into another one. I have another one, of course, at the top of my head, too.
Okay, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so along the lines of batteries, I have been covering this company, Our Next to Energy, for a while. They're a startup based in Michigan. And their whole approach is to take two different chemistries, basically two different types of batteries, put them in the same pack and let basically electronics balance which one's going to be used at which time. And that essentially allows them to take batteries with very different strengths and weaknesses. So one of which is very durable, can be used and charged every single day, but is maybe a little bit heavier, but inexpensive. And pair it with a more esoteric, fragile battery type that maybe doesn't last quite, through as many charge cycles, but could kind of serve to be that reserve, so that if you need to drive, 500 miles, you can tap into that. And then on your daily driving, you just tap into the one that's durable and can be used all the time. And I thought that was a nice example of kind of some of those, I guess, different ways of thinking about batteries, and how as battery technology becomes more advanced and kind of radiates and diversifies, that you're going to start to see some of these unique solutions that come in that we wouldn't have imagined 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when you talk about technology in different industries and verticals, it can be solutions in search of a problem. But in general, and the two ones you've mentioned here really are, I think, solutions for problems, right? They are very much taking what's out there and saying, how can we use technology to solve that existing problem? And I think that's always, kind of, I don't know, it's hopeful and optimistic to see that people are doing those things, and that it can have that real impact, rather than just, let's find a new way to, buy clothes or something like that. This is really kind of hitting on something that has a deeper impact. How has the discourse around sustainability changed from the time when you began writing about this topic? I know you've been in this space for a while now. So what have you seen change around sustainability as it relates to your coverage and how things are being talked about?
Yeah, I think it's changed significantly, right? If you were to look at this space 20 years ago, it had a different flavor to it. This was in the run-up to kind of the clean tech boom that happened at the late 2000s. And people were, I think, optimistic at the time and dedicated to it, and you could start to see it creep into the mainstream. But there also wasn't this, commitment to it. It was kind of like a nice to have. It was a benefit. And there was still some, I would say it was not a complete embrace of the sorts of technologies and approaches that we're seeing today. So there was still talk of natural gas as a bridge fuel, cogeneration, things like that. And I think over time, and as the climate crisis has kind of like become more front and center in people's lives, I think you've started to see realization for what actually needs to happen. And as a result, I think the focus and coverage has shifted. I think that the solutions that are being presented have shifted. You're not talking about, well, maybe we can kind of keep fossil fuels going for a little bit longer. People are talking about a very serious end date to some of those, and thinking about how we can make direct replacements, not only in like everyday life, right? It's actually, I wouldn't say inexpensive, but if you have the funds these days, it's not totally impossible to decarbonize large portions of your life, right? But then, of course, there are still some things that it's very hard to decarbonize, right? Air travel, cement, steel making, things like that. And where I think it differs now is before we were looking for low carbon ways to do it. Now we're looking for completely carbon free ways to do it, or in some cases, even carbon negative ways to accomplish those. And they're not ready yet, but you're starting to see founders, investors, and regulators look at it through a very different lens than they would have, 10, 15 years ago even.
Yeah. So great segue. I was just going to ask you, what are some of the most innovative trends you've seen in the carbon market?
Yeah, I think there are some interesting things thinking about how we can remove carbon from the atmosphere. There are a number of startups working on direct air capture. So those are basically giant fans that blow ambient air over some kind of solution that will then pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then they usually inject it underground for storage. There are companies that are working with minerals that they crush up and spread on farm fields that basically will naturally absorb carbon dioxide over time. And by crushing it up and spreading it, you're able to speed that process, known as enhanced rock weathering. And then there's another one that I just covered that's making concrete in a different way than we make it today. And that allows it to absorb either both avoid carbon dioxide in its manufacture and absorb it over time. So I think those are kind of cool. The other thing that I think has been interesting lately is it's not really a trend in the carbon market, but thinking about how we can encourage decarbonization investments, not just in developed countries, but in the developing world as well. It's becoming easier now to finance clean energy projects through kind of more traditional debt financing. And I think countries are realizing that if they can take the private capital markets and couple it maybe with public incentives or grants, that could kind of help developing countries take that extra step to kind of kiss fossil fuels goodbye, right? They've got a lot invested right now in their current generation infrastructure. And really all that's holding them back is that initial capital investment to replace those. That's not always the case, but in many cases, that's what it is. Because once they're able to do that, the ongoing costs of running that new, clean energy infrastructure are lower than their existing fossil fuel ones. So in some ways, it can make a lot more sense. So again, not really a traditional carbon market, but I think we're starting to see some interesting ways of using capital markets to encourage decarbonization.
We mentioned at the top your involvement with Future Proof, and I'm wondering what advice would you give to a founder looking to build a media company and brand in 2023? Or maybe another way to look at this would be, what do you know now that you wish you knew previously in thinking about building a media company and brand in 2023?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest thing is to think about the diversity of your income streams. When I launched Future Proof, I was really interested in the, basically like, how can I get affiliate income? That was all the rage for a while. There were entire publications started and sold off based on that premise. And it seemed somewhat promising. Around the time that I actually got around to launching it, memberships started taking off. And a lot of people went whole hog into memberships. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of those. I think they're all beneficial, but I think the key is that you have to have a diversified income stream. You can't just do affiliate income. You can't just do memberships. You can't just do advertising. I think we're seeing today a lot of companies that are dependent on advertising income are going through rounds and rounds of layoffs. And ideally, if you have that diversified income stream, you're maybe not taking as much of a hit. The events business obviously took a hit during the pandemic. But if you have some other legs to stand on, that certainly helps. And so thinking about diversification in income is definitely one of them. And then I'll say on the climate side, if you're interested in that, I would think, very seriously about it's the Wayne Gretzky quote, right? Think to where the puck is headed, skate to where the puck's going. And that's what you want to do. We don't want to necessarily focus on the technologies that are happening today, but those that are likely to happen in a few years. Calling that right is tricky, of course, but if you can do it, you're going to have an audience that's going to trust in your judgment.
So, the world that you and I live in, we talk a lot about what's happening, from startups and coming out of Silicon Valley. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act and the impact that it can have on climate tech companies.
Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, has been really transformative from all of the founders I've spoken with. A lot of people like to say they don't found companies, they don't invest in companies that are dependent on government regulation or laws, things like that. But the reality is that we all live in a regulatory environment, right? The world has laws and we all follow them. And that creates opportunities and challenges in different places. And when the law changes, those opportunities and challenges shift. And it's no question that the Inflation Reduction Act has shifted those. We've seen tens of billions of dollars invested in battery manufacturing infrastructure in the U.S., for example, in the last 9 months since it's passed or so. And I think we're going to see even more of that. It's also kind of revitalized the automotive manufacturing industry in this country. But then even less obvious things, heat pumps have gotten a big bump from that. I'm walking around my house, I see companies that used to install new oil burner furnaces in people's homes are now starting to put out little signs when they're doing work, advertising ductless heat pumps for people's homes. And so that kind of shift, I think, is going to be felt not just in the startup world, but throughout the economy. But of course it is, startup companies are looking for those new opportunities. And so you're starting to see that as well, right? There's a number of new companies focused on heat pumps, both manufacturing them themselves or creating software around managing them. Same with home battery backups, again, hardware and software around managing that, creating both backups for the homes and backup for the grid. And so I think as the law starts to take into effect, as we get further along and the regulations get written around that law, I think you're going to start to see more opportunities for either ways to transform the grid, developing electric vehicle infrastructure, or thinking about opportunities for decarbonization in homes, commercial spaces, and even industrial uses.
Interesting. Well, this is a really great conversation that we're having, Tim, and I loved hearing about punctuated equilibrium and what's going on in the fusion area. As we wrap it up here, anything else that you're working on right now that you want to maybe give us a little sneak preview of, or anything you're looking forward to the second half of this year?
Yeah, a couple things. One of which is, I've been thinking a lot about, what are the roles for basically non-white men founders in the climate tech space. Unfortunately, the sector does tend to track very similarly to other sectors that venture capital invests in. And so working on a story right now, thinking about, first examining the data, which, as I said, is not great. And then trying to find places where Black, Latino and Latina investors and founders are diving in, and same with female founders and investors. Because I think, everybody brings a unique perspective to it, and especially something like climate tech, which has a very broad remit and is tackling probably the largest problem of our time. We're going to need all the different perspectives that we can get to focus on this. And then the other thing I'm working on is just kind of like thinking broadly about 2023. There was a lot of talk about the downturn in the last 6 months to a year, and we're seeing a bit of that in climate tech. But given, again, the enormity of the problem, the fact that it's not going away, and then also some of the regulatory and policy changes that we've seen, I think the second half of the year is probably going to look a little bit differently. So I'm going to explore that a little bit more.
All right. Tim Chant, Senior Climate Reporter at TechCrunch. Thank you so much for joining us on Climb today.
Thank you, Rick.
Well, that's all for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Special thanks to Credo for their help in producing and promoting this episode. To visit any part of today's conversation again, you can find the full transcript on vscventures.com. Our thanks to Josue Ramiro for posting these every week. Lastly, if you've listened this far, please leave us a rating on Spotify or review on iTunes. It only takes a few seconds, really helps us out, and as far as I know, it's still carbon neutral. Well, that's all for now. We'll see you all next week on Climb by VSC.